Hey everybody, big thanks to our subscribers for coming back for part 2 of this build, and stick around to the end and we'll show you all the details of how the pieces and parts work together. Yeah, okay, the thumbnail was a play on words, but it was finally time to add some motion to my sculpture. And as far as the bathroom goes,
Yeah, man, it really tied the room together.
well, maybe not. But listen, in order to see the first part of the build where we design the gears and actually put the components together for the flower, click on the card to the upper right and you'll see the first part of the build. Now, let's get to some engineering.
Make it work.
So all good things need a good foundation. So I started off with this 3/4 inch piece of maple and cut it down to size. And I also have a really thin piece of birch that'll go on top of the maple because I need to cut out a big section in the middle of that to hide the battery and the motor. And you'll see that a little bit later. Now the two Nautilus gears that I built in the first part of the video were made out of walnut, but included some sapwood, so they're really cool two-tone here with the lighter color vanilla and then the walnut darker color in the center. Now here's with that maple flipped over, and you can see the hollowed out back that I cut. And I also reinforced that thin piece of birch with some epoxy. That's the shiny stuff you see in the middle there. Now this will be the T-nut that'll hold the two flower discs at the top of the sculpture. And that hole that I drilled on the inside is for this little 12-volt electric motor. And it's going to run off of a 12-volt electric battery. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now, my original design was to have pretty much the entire sculpture driven off of this shaft, which would turn the gear, and then there'd be some drive belts to turn the flowers. But in order to do that, in order to make the drive belts work, I had to create some custom pulleys, which I carved out of walnut. So I needed a pulley to turn each one of the flower wheels, and I needed a couple extra so that I could drive the belts up to the wheels. Butterfingers, man. And of course, anytime you use a lathe, it makes a huge mess. So here's that shaft turning my spindle that I had turned out of walnut. So I changed my line of thinking for how I wanted to drive the two flower wheels at the top of the sculpture. And this is what I started out with. I got this drilled out so that it fits over the shaft of that motor, and then it would have driven two belts for the back flower wheel and the front flower wheel. So where we started out as it being a direct drive off that motor shaft using this, I kind of tried a couple of different designs that didn't work very well, and ultimately I wound up going back to cut out that maple block. So rather than drive the entire sculpture off of that aluminum shaft of that motor, it wasn't really all that stable. In fact, the taller that I made that spindle, the worse it got. So out of maple, I decided to create a idler pulley, which essentially is something I can bolt down onto bearings, have it spin freely, and that can actually drive both the flowers and then connect to the motor. Now I'm just going to cut this free. And I already have a wider hole drilled in the top of this spindle for a bearing. But I need something for the bearings to connect to, so I've got this 1/2 inch piece of aluminum tubing that actually fits on that inside bearing ring. So that makes a great spacer, just like you would put in a pair of rollerblade bearings. Now I went to the trouble of actually ordering, and it took 6 weeks to get in, this 22 millimeter Forstner bit, which is supposed to be exactly the right size for the bearing, but as it turns out, the 7/8 inch Forstner bit that I had from Ryobi cut exactly the same size hole. I was pretty disappointed that I paid the extra money for that 22 millimeter bit. But I had to drill these all the way through because these pieces are going to go up to each one of the flower wheels. And then the Nautilus gears were cut through so that I could glue in these bearings. And this was just thick CA glue or thick super glue. And there's bearings in each one of the flower wheels also. Now the drive belts are just 1/8 inch urethane plastic belts that you heat up, and when they melt, you can stick them together, and they are pretty rock solid. Now I've seen a couple different methods to clean these up, but nail clippers worked for me, so why not, right? And then just testing those belts out. Now this is still my first test when I was using the old spindle design. And the top belt is straight up. The bottom belt is crossed over once, so it'll turn the wheels in different directions.
Upgrades.
Upgrades for sure. So here's that maple pulley, and it's bolted right down to a T-nut underneath, and that gives me a rock solid base to be able to turn those belts and not have it bend front or back like it did on the original setup with that tall spindle on this aluminum shaft of the motor. So we'll get this tiny pulley glued onto the shaft. In fact, the smaller pulley on the shaft will reduce the overall speed of the bigger pulleys. But this is the first chance really on the new design for me to put everything together. In fact, I forgot to put the belt on the idler pulley here, but this will spin freely. It'll be driven by that motor pulley. And this gives you an idea of how that's going to work. And the idler pulley turns really smoothly. And I'm going to have to re-glue my Nautilus gear back on. A couple of other decorative pieces you'll see later. Let's talk about the motor and the battery for a minute. I got both of these on Amazon, and the motor is just a 12-volt motor. It runs about 24 watts. But the important thing is it turns slow. It's a worm gear. It's only 20 RPM. And so the speed actually worked out really well for me. Now the battery, also a little bit more than 20 bucks, 24 watt, 12 volt battery, rechargeable. And it's got a rechargeable port added to the battery that I'm going to drill into the side of the sculpture here to make it easy for me to plug it in and charge it back up. So like I said, for a prototype, this really isn't going to be all that pretty. This was mangled because I needed some more support to hold that bolt. But it'll be fine to just finish this out as a working concept. And so with a little hot glue, I'll be able to put in the charging port into the side. And there's a little switch on this battery that I need to be able to get my finger underneath to turn on and off. So I'll leave a little bit of room here on the battery when I glue this down to be able to turn it on.
My God, pull yourself together!
Now we're going to do some final assembly, and here's where I've got to reinstall that Nautilus gear back on this idler pulley. And to make sure that that was centered, and we'll get it all bolted down, making sure that I put the belt on this time. And then the bottom Nautilus gear is just screwed down into a free-floating bearing here because it's just going to spin on its own. And then one more coat of finish on both the flower wheels and the Nautilus gears, and then also the base. And this is just a clear lacquer finish. And I had a couple of the decorative pieces there off to the left that we finished up also. Now, in order to put the flower wheels back together, they had to be spaced exactly the same distance off of the base as the idler pulley grooves. So I had the spacers laid out so that I wouldn't screw that up when I tried to put it back together, but trying to get everything assembled with the tension of the belts was a pain. I went back and forth to try to assemble this right side up. I flipped it over to try to assemble it upside down. The belts kept getting caught. I thought I would actually record some of my struggle. And this is what you have to do when you're playing around with a new idea. It's going to be painful. You're going to redo a bunch of stuff like I did with this sculpture, but keep it going. Stay focused. And here it is, finally. You can see the belt drive system connecting the idler pulley up to the top two wheels. And now I'm going to hot glue some of those decorative pieces back on, just covering up the bolt holes. And this is just hot glue because if I ever need to take it apart or tighten it up, I'm going to need to get to those bolts. Now it's official. The back side of it's pretty ugly, but I really like it as a working model. So it really turned out beautiful. I actually hung this in a couple different areas of our home, and it looks good like anywhere I hang it. So right now I have it down in my work from home office, like we're all like working from home in this day and age of COVID-19. And I especially like I wasn't sure how these were going to turn out, but the Nautilus gears, what a trip trying to get these put together. You'll have to see the first video to see how we created those. But you can't take your eyes off of it while it's working. I got big thumbs up from my kids on this project. Daddy like. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this week's video. And as always, if you like our content, we hope you give us a thumbs up, you subscribe to the channel, and if you hit the bell icon, you'll get notified every time we publish something new. Take care.